I think I hinted to how I reconcile it when I said that the end of a project like Zionism is one of the worst periods for the colonized people. That I'm sure that Zionism is going to end. I really believe it. I can see the indicators. I really see them clearly. I can see the indicators of the beginning of the end. But as an historian, I know that the beginning of the end can be a decade, 2 decades, even 3 decades. I'm afraid that as an historian, I'm allowed to say it, but as a human being, I don't want to say it. I don't want to be there for 30 years in a situation. And these 30 years or 20, hopefully 20, hopefully a shorter period, are very, very dangerous. And the question is, how do we protect the people through processes that they are not always at their power to influence, that they are dangerous to them as well in the short run, but hopeful in the long run? I think that's the balance act I'm looking for.
Welcome to a new episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Usama Makdisi, and I'm a professor of history at UC Berkeley. And I'm joined, as always, by my brothers Sadi Makdisi, professor of English and comparative literature at UCLA. Sadi, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you.
And Karim Makdisi, a professor of international politics at AUB. Karim, as always, it's wonderful to see you.
Hello. Hi to everybody.
Our discussion today does what our podcast always tries to do. It offers an historical and political understanding of current events, an understanding of history and politics through current events. So in other words, what is happening now and how do we make sense of it? Despite the dark times we're in, we're delighted to have with us one of the most distinguished historians and scholars of the modern Middle East, of Palestine and of Israel, Professor Ilan Pappé. We could think, in fact, of no better scholar to join us to talk about what is happening today in Gaza, in Palestine, and in Israel than Professor Pappé, because Ilan is a professor of history at the University of Exeter, where he is also the director of the Palestine Studies Center. Ilan, Professor Pappé, is also the author of many, many brilliant books, the most famous of which is The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which was first published in 2006. Although Professor Pappé is a son of German Jewish parents who fled Nazi persecution, Ilan himself was expelled from Haifa University because of his commitment to truth, because of his bravery, and because of his scholarship about the Nakba of 1948. In fact, Ilan played a key role in supervising work that unearthed evidence of the massacre at Tantura in 1948 that had been denied for decades by the Israeli state, but that now you can actually learn about in a documentary called, in fact, Tantura. Ilan, welcome to our show. We're delighted to have you with us today. We'd like to start with a basic question, which is, what is your understanding and sense of what is happening today on the ground in Gaza and the Israeli thinking about what's happening on the ground?
What we see unfolding in front of our eyes in the last 2 months, in fact, now more than 2 months, that is ever since the 7th of October, is Israel using as a pretext the events of the 7th of October to pursue policies that either it pursued on a low kind of key level in the past, or new policies it never dared fully to implement in the past, and they're using the events as a pretext to implement them now. What I mean by this is that Israel was always troubled by the Gaza Strip as a problem, as a situation it was not able to control in the same way as it could the West Bank, for instance, or the Palestinian minority inside Israel. Gaza was a problem, and as you probably all remember, they thought they had found a solution for what they called the Gaza Strip problem when they withdrew the Israeli settlers and hoped, which didn't happen, that the Palestinian Authority would take over the Gaza Strip, and then Israel could have kind of created there an Area A, similar to Area A in the West Bank. This did not happen because of the democratic elections that took place in the Gaza Strip, among other places, which brought the Hamas to power. Then Israel did what it does in such a situation when it cannot control the situation. It imposes collective punishment on people. This time the collective punishment was translated into land siege and naval blockade on the Gaza Strip. And when the Hamas reacted to that siege, as you know, Israel full-time assaulted the Gaza Strip with lethal weapons, aerial bombardment, and so on. And yet, there was a sense in Israel that this is an inertia that can continue. Namely, we can kind of manage every 5 or 6 years around, if you want, the confrontational round with the Hamas. And in the meantime, it see also the benefits from it, be it training of our army, not the situation there does not constitute any existential danger for the state. And this is the best we can have, kind of using our military force in order to maintain the siege and in order to react to the resistance to the siege and the blockade. Obviously, this didn't work, as we can see on the 7th of October. Something else is happening there. And then they moved to a much more ruthless and cruel and totally immoral and illegal policy, which they could not implement before, but they're now using the events as a pretext. Namely, first of all, taking over more territory from the Gaza Strip, in order to create a situation where these settlements that were attacked on the 7th of October would not be adjacent anymore to the Strip, that there will be a buffer zone. Secondly, pressuring the population, or as much of the population as possible, to leave the Strip. They hoped that even Egypt would be willing to take some of the people of Gaza, and if this is not possible, maybe other countries would be willing to take it. And if this fails, at least they want to squeeze the population, which already is squeezing one of the most densely populated area in the world, into even a smaller enclave. I don't think they think beyond that. I mean, what they feel is that they have the power to uproot the military resistance that troubled them. Didn't trouble them that much until they understood on the 7th of October that it is far more serious than they ever estimated. And at the same time, create a demographic and geographical situation, as they've done all through the history of Zionism in Israel. This balance between geography and demography, creating more space for Israel, extending Israel, and downsizing the Palestinian population as much as possible. They feel that they have a window of opportunity to do it. Maybe some of them think that time may run out of it, but this, I think, is more or less where the mindset of those who make the policy is kind of can be described or analyzed.
Ilan, this is Sari. Just so, I concur. I think that seems to be, insofar as they have a plan or insofar as they're thinking, that does exactly seem to be what's in their mind. But of course, anybody can have plans, but then they run into complications or resistance or obstacles to the execution of their plan. And in this case, there are two. It seems like there's at least two main factors, maybe even three main factors. One factor, obviously, is the resistance they're encountering on the ground, meaning from when they enter on the ground. Bombing from the air is one thing, but entering on the ground is a whole different kettle of fish. And they, by all accounts, they seem to be facing very stiff resistance and suffering pretty considerable casualties of their own. So the armed resistance is one obstacle. The second obstacle is that, yes, they have clearly displaced, I forgot the number now, 1.9 million. The vast majority of Gaza's population has been pushed around to different kinds of places, but there seems to be, as far as I could tell anyway, there seems to be a refusal on the part of the people to leave altogether. Like they've left, but they haven't left they've left their homes because their homes have been destroyed, but they're still in Gaza, and they seem to have no inclination to want to leave Gaza. So that's the second obstacle, is the people themselves. And the third obstacle is obviously the massive international reaction that's taking place, which of course we have to split into the reaction of the Western states, which are supporting this action, with money and UN support and bombs and all the rest of it. But then there's, on the other hand, a massive popular counter reaction, which seems to me, and we'll talk about this maybe more later on, but it seems to me that that's like a game changer in some sense, that the Israelis are alienating the very popular base that supported them for all these years. They're kind of using up all of their moral capital, I think, if not having depleted it altogether. So what do you think of those three sources of, let's say, friction or obstacles that they have to deal with in one way or another? The resistance on the ground, the will of the people themselves, and then the international kind of dimension to it.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, I fully agree with you, because I was talking about what the Israelis want to do. I'm not sure they can do it. Let's start, and I will add another serious obstacle, but I will talk about it a bit later. The first point that you mentioned is definitely unfolding in front of our eyes. The Israeli army already lost 100 soldiers. Its promises to be at a very different point in time, and in brackets we should mention its failure to release most of those who were taken as hostages on the 7th of October, is something that will slow down the implementation, or at least will delay what the Israelis would call the day after. They have now created a special team in the Prime Minister office called the Day After Team. But I think that this is going to be much longer, and the longer it takes place, also their own domestic public opinion can also react differently from the way it reacts now, especially when there seems to be the beginning, although the official media tries to cover it, but there seems to be a realization that the longer this continues, the likelihood of having a peaceful release of the hostages or a proper exchange of prisoners deal is not on the cards anymore. So I think I would add this to this overall remark that you have made. At this moment in time, they still have, and one should say this objectively, they have still young soldiers with a lot of motivation because of the way the narrative was concocted after the 7th of October, something similar to the Holocaust, which is an abuse of the Holocaust memory, but that's another issue. But it is portrayed like a Holocaust, and young soldiers are, unlike during the Holocaust, you are fighting for the Jewish people as a whole. Don't underestimate it. I mean, it really, it's a very highly motivated, fanatic young soldiers. And many of them, by the way, in the special units come from the settler community, so they're even doubly motivated, and dehumanizes the Palestinians. So they are doing a lot of damage. But you're absolutely right. As for the second obstacle, yes, definitely. And this is something that nobody in Israel talks about, of course, the fact that most of the Palestinians that they are uprooting are refugees of a first and second round of refugees. And therefore, they know too well what does it mean to, what does it mean to leave either temporarily or not temporarily and become refugees forever. Away from the homeland. So I think you're absolutely right. Whatever the Israelis would like to happen, their idea that there is an external actor, either Egypt or any other country, there would be a receptor of such a large number of people, I think is an illusion. So whatever they do, and I think I'm beginning to hear this realization that the day after includes millions of Palestinians still living, or at least 1.5 million to 2 million people still living in Gaza. They're beginning to realize it. They still don't know what to do with it, but they understand that Netanyahu's ideas of this ethnic cleansing, which is not just internal ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip, but ethnic cleansing outside of the historical Palestine boundaries, is not a real and possible scenario. And yes, the international community although, of course, we have this American position. This is not new. I mean, we have this situation now for years. It just comes out this time maybe in a more acute way. But, I like to say that we have here global Israel against global Palestine. Global Israel is the Western governments, some multinational corporation, military industries, loyal Jewish and Christian communities, especially in the West, that together with the EU, as I said, probably most of the governments of the global North, and they would give Israel a license to continue. And they will condemn some of the actions, but I don't think they will impose sanctions or stop it. And then we have global Palestine, as I call it. Global Palestine is the civil societies in the global North, some governments in the global South, definitely. And this is a struggle. We've been there before. I mean, this is not a new struggle. And the question is who is going to have the upper hand in many ways in taming, constraining, and stopping Israel. Very hard to predict. Very hard to predict, but of course, this is something to pay attention to. I wanted to add a false obstacle. The 7th of October created a false sense of unity in a Jewish society that was on the brink of a kind of a cold civil war before the 7th of October. We tend to forget it, but the secular Jewish society was at loggerheads. I mean, more than loggerheads. It was a real confrontation over the image of the Jewish state. The Palestinians were not part of that discussion, but what does it mean to be a Jew in Israel became a very contested issue that led hundreds of thousands of Israelis to demonstrate and to a kind of a disunity that I don't remember in the 75 years of Israel in terms of the way people talked about each other, felt about each other, the willingness of economic and cultural elites to leave the country, or at least to be relocated temporarily because of the feeling that the theocratic fundamentalist Jews from the settlers community are taking over and they don't have the power to stop them. Some didn't even go to the army. The 7th of October created the sense that this is behind the Israelis because of that. But it's coming back. Every day that this operation continues, there is more of the old kind of dissent coming back to the fore through the main media and definitely through the internet and other places. So I think that is also something that would eventually influence the ability of the Israelis to do whatever they want in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, hi, Ilan, it's Karim. I want to actually go back a little bit because you've said so much here, but I want to go back a little bit and ask. I mean, I have, in fact, your wonderful book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, in front of me, and in it, of course, you sort of detail incredible detail the master plan that kind of led to the first ethnic cleansing in 47 or 48. And if one were to read even the blurbs and anything you'd see, or the back of it, you'd see it's almost like it's written today for what's going on in Gaza. And I'm wondering, to what extent, and a lot of us are asking, to what extent was there a plan ready? Before this war, was there something hatched, or is that just an ideological thing? I mean, it's there in the ideology, but was there some kind of plan delet? Was there some kind of plan that was there in case something happens? Or as it appeared in the beginning, at least to someone like me, it just seemed to be bumbling across. They weren't ready, they didn't know, and there was this reaction, and then they were kind of making it up as they went along. And then Blinken and Biden, these people came to, I mean, that's how it appears from outside, they came to put a proper strategy, they came to kind of guide them, to kind of pat them on the back and set them on a proper strategic kind of thing and objectives that can work, etc. So I'm wondering if you have any clarifications on that.
Yes, well, I could write with confidence, Karim, about Plan D because time has passed since 1948. I had historical perspective. I had access to documentation, at first declassified documentation, but also open sources that were relatively easy to find and on their basis to come to the conclusion about 1948. Unfortunately, here we don't have that access. But what you say sounds to me very reasonable, namely that they had, and that's what I was trying to, in my answer to Osama, to point to. I think they had a concept of how to run the affairs of the Gaza Strip. And that concept included, of course, harsh collective punishment whenever they thought that the Hamas resistance was going too far, or whenever they wanted to test, maybe, who knows, there's a cynical idea that sounds unfortunately valid, that sometimes they even started operations in order to test some new weapons, as was seen by a very famous documentary called The Laboratory by Feldman, which shows that there is a connection there as well. But the idea was that if we have to go into Gaza, it's for short periods with full force of the Air Force, and then ensure a quiet period for few years. I don't think that in their old concept, the ethnic cleansing of Gaza on such a proportion was there. But as I said, we don't have access to the documentation. I think that this plan of, first of all, telling the people in Gaza of the north to move to the south, and now thinking aloud of what to do with the people in the south, can we move them outside as well? I think you're right. This is developing as the operation continues, rather than it's an implementation of a plan that was in a drawer before. However, as an historian, I can tell you, and all of us are in that perspective, it's not enough, I think, to analyze and say, okay, this was developing as the events unfolded. It develops in such a way because there is a certain ideological context to this. Otherwise, it will not develop in this direction. Namely, because, and I think that's why my 48 book is relevant, because the international community did not condemn the ethnic cleansing of 1948, Israel regards ethnic cleansing as a totally legitimate method of protecting what it would see as its national interest. And they still believe that if they do ethnic cleansing through the context of a war, or through the pretext, rather, of a war, the international community, or those that matters to them in the international community, would allow this to happen. And I think that is very important. I think that's our role as historians, to say that you need to go to the ideological source from which these kinds of actions are coming, even if these actions were decided, ad hoc by the policymakers.
Ilan, so following up on that question, Karim, this is Usama here. One question that I ask in terms of being a historian, so you've worked on 1948. You're right, we don't have the documentation now, but I'm sure when the documents come out and the archives are released, it'll be more shocking than we anticipated. But don't you think there is a difference in terms of, we said global Palestine, global Israel, between 1948, when the Palestinians there was no solidarity on a global scale with there was a few states there was Islamic communities, of course, but there wasn't this level of consciousness. Especially today, there's a level of consciousness about what happened in 1948, which obviously in 1948 people had no idea what was going to happen to them, and they were shocked. The Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing plan that you detail with such detail in your book was carried out and effectively carried out and ethnically cleansed Palestine. But the Palestinians had no idea what was going to happen. Today, of course, they do. And people around the world have a much stronger sense. So does that matter at one level? And the second question, following from what Karim was saying, is that in the Arab world and in the media of the Arab world, at least the media that is not hostile to Palestinians, there is a sense that it's the US that runs Israel, that this is an American operation rather than an Israeli operation. And to what extent is that just too simplistic, or to what extent is that accurate? That, in other words, Israel is doing this because there is a US plan to dominate the region. How do you contextualize this in a wider frame?
or if Ilan, sorry, it's just to double to add to Osama's question, to what extent is there a convergence of Israeli and American, if not planning, then action, or a convergence of what they think are their interests, as opposed to the tail wagging the dog, or the dog wagging the tail, I guess is another way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me first go to 1948. I think we all probably, I think, without asking you beforehand if you agree, we all have a very, well, let's say, quite a negative view on the way the neighboring Arab states behaved in 1948. But I must say that the more I'm thinking about it, the more I go back to that period as an historian, I do realize that, and I'm quite serious in what I say, and as an historian, I cannot prove it, so I'm just putting here an assumption. Had the Arab armies not entered, or the troops, these were not proper armies, but there were, a significant number of soldiers, okay? Had these significant numbers of soldiers not entered from Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria into historical Palestine, the number of Palestinian refugees would have been far, far larger. And probably most of the Palestinians would have found themselves outside of Palestine. Now, I'm not saying that this is the main reason why some of the Arab states eventually dispatched their troops into Palestine, but it's important to understand that it did what the Hezbollah didn't do. It really forced the ethnic cleansing operation to be more limited than they were planned, because the idea was really to empty the whole of Palestine from every Palestinian. This was definitely what was on the cards. Why do I say this? That these historical comparison needs to be a bit more complex to my mind. But you're absolutely right about the international community. And because the military effort by the Arab state was too late and too little, the Israeli, we can call them now the Israelis because we are talking about what happened after the 15th of May, the Israelis were able to manage the two fronts, the front vis-a-vis the Arab armies, which more or less ended in August 1948, and do the most important bit of the ethnic cleansing in its late stages in September and October up to the end of the year of 1948. So there is something there to think about. Even if these are not genuine solidarities, what happens if the neighboring countries are doing something in order to salvage the Palestinians? But about the international community, you're absolutely right. That's a different setup. It's a different world. And what I call global Palestine, namely this huge alliance of people who see their own struggles for justice totally connected to the struggle for justice in Palestine, is a powerful actor. It's a powerful presence, and it already has impact. It doesn't change yet the reality on the ground, but it has the potential to change the reality on the ground. Now, for the question of the US, I think it's always a bit difficult to distinguish between if you want, the tail and the dog here, because the Israeli, I think we seem to agree, unless we'll see documentation to contradict this. We all agree that the Israeli reaction was kind of built as a response to the 7th of October. I mean, there is a conspiracy theory in Israel going on that the performance of the Israeli army was so dismal on the 7th of October that maybe Netanyahu wanted, and by the way, the intelligence in Israel was so clear that the Hamas is going to do it. We now have so much intelligence coming out that shows that it's very difficult to believe that they didn't see the very clear signs that this was going to happen, right? Anyway, but I still don't buy into this conspiracy until I will see something more solid. I'm just mentioning it in brackets. But because I do think that what the Israeli operation, when we talk about the Israeli operation, it developed as a response rather than that the whole chess game was planned. We want the Hamas to attack and then we know what we're going to do. I don't think we're there, but let's keep an open mind about that as well. But let's say that this is right, that this is a reaction. The American game here has points of contact with the Israeli strategy, but first of all, the Israeli strategy is not a unified strategy. There are two very different basic Israeli orientations here among the policymakers. One of them is totally in accordance and in tandem with the American way of thinking, and one is troublesome for the Americans, almost a liability for the Americans. So we have to remember the composition of the political elite today in Israel, that from there comes the group of policymakers that decide what to do tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. You have what you can call the kind of center-right Zionist parties or mindset, call it what you want. Most of them are ex-generals, ex-servicemen in the Secret Service, in the Mossad. This is the group that tries to, they feel that they are taming Netanyahu and his allies on the extreme right. I think they work very closely with the Americans and are willing, by the way, to play sometimes a symbolic game. Hopefully sometimes it would be more meaningful game in responding to American demands for more humanitarian aid, maybe to end the direct military operations a bit earlier on, and at the same time use the whole situation as a pretext to help America in its war against what a Democratic Party, which is crazy to say it when I hear myself saying it, that the Democratic Party is adopting a Republican discourse of an axis of evil that connects Russia, China, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas into a new alliance of evil. And therefore, situations like this enable you to, if not destroy this alliance, then to weaken it, to undermine it. And of course, by those actions, they actually create the alliance. The alliance isn't there, but America is creating the alliance by its own actions. And this is the worldview also of that group that I call them central right. The extreme right in Israel, which is very powerful and holds very strong position, Netanyahu pushed them out of what they call the war cabinet. That was the condition of those who joined, from the opposition. So they're not in the war cabinet. So these lunatics and fanatics and fundamentalist Zionists are not in the cabinet that decides what to do tomorrow in Khan Yunis or in Gaza, but they are very important factor in the wider cabinet that will decide about the day after. And they would like to bring the settlers back to the Gaza Strip. They would like to use, and they're already pushing this with their settlers in the West Bank, to begin an ethnic cleansing of the West Bank to Jordan. And this is why they're putting pressure, and they already succeeded in at least doing the same thing in Gaza, but the world doesn't look at it. Thousands of Palestinians were moved from the south of the West Bank to the north. Here the direction is different. By the actions of the settlers when the army was stood by and allowed them to destroy villages in Masafer Aliyata, the south of Mount Hebron. This is something that I think is a bit too much for the American. It's like you have these allies of yours that some of them are too unreliable and so on. So I think we have to look at these also domestic Israeli balance of power. But all in all, this, a friend of mine said, it's just unbelievable when you hear the American Secretary of State says, in moments like this, I'm a Jew. I mean, anti-Semites would jump on this. For 100 years, the American Jewish community was trying to convince the American public that there isn't such a thing as Jew loyalty, that American Jews are loyal to Israel. And then he says, no, in a moment like this, I'm not the Secretary of State of the United States, I'm the Secretary of State of the Jewish state. And Biden kind of talks about his attachment. I don't know if you've seen his two last appearances. He talks about Israel like a basketball team that he's, kind of admires, and he has kind of a scratch in his heart for that and so on. It stupefies the American policymakers, because I think that either it is the tail that wags the dog, namely it's still a very powerful lobby that influences their policies, or they don't have the Democratic Party, unlike the neocons, really don't have a clear vision of international relations. The more I'm thinking about it, that's my conclusion. I think that they have some sort of a domestic agenda in America, but they have not figured out how do they build a counter worldview to the Republican one. Sometimes they act like Republicans or Republicans on steroids, and sometimes they counter it in talking, not so much in action. And we can see it in the Ukraine, we can see it in China, we can see it in India. So this is something that I think allows the Israelis this ability to make sure that the U.S. is an ally that helps and, talks the talk but doesn't walk the walk.
Ilan, can I ask you, this is Karim. As you were saying this, I was looking up Joe Biden yesterday, I think it was in the White House Hanukkah party. He says, where there no Israel, there wouldn't be a Jew in the world that is safe. So, I mean, this kind of is sort of goes to what you were saying, this trope that you're talking about. And I wonder, I mean, it seems to me to be quite difficult for Jews across the world to be able to identify with that, or do they? I mean, obviously it's a question for you that I'd like to have. But the second question, I saw a recent poll inside Israel that said that something to the effect of around 80% of Jewish Israelis supported this war in Gaza. So again, from the outside, can you explain to us how we're supposed to think about the way in which the Jewish reaction has been, whether it's global Israel or inside itself, looking at this thing, the extent to the dehumanization versus the extent of fear, just like actual fear as opposed to dehumanization, prioritization of our lives versus their lives, any of these things. To what extent is there a place to reach out to that's not just a fringe kind of left thing? If you could talk about that, would be great.
Yeah, correct. First of all, if you want some good news, I think there are many, many Jews who are part of what I call global Palestine. And there are less and less Jews in what I call global Israel. In fact, there are more Christian Zionists in global Israel than Jews, to my mind. If I haven't checked it statistically, but that's an intuitive kind of appreciation. And therefore, I think, although without knowing the numbers, there's a lot of Jews, especially Jews who are not part of an institutional Jewish community organization, that would be appalled by what President Biden said. Not to mention, of course, that the message to American Jews, you are not safe, is horrendous. I really think this is what I was recently in Germany meeting with some heads of faculties and so on. And I couldn't hold myself. Rather politely, I did say to them, I've never met such a large number of educated, sensitive, brilliant people talk like infantiles when they talk about Israel. I mean, nothing of your faculties, capabilities, knowledge comes to play. It's not at play when you talk about Israel. Nothing, not your knowledge, nor your moral backbone. So either it's fear, because I know you're not stupid, so it must be fear. So get over it, I said to them. Really, it's embarrassing. It's pathetic. And you feel the same, because I'm sure that if you'll talk to Biden about, health reform, social reform, maybe even, the minorities situation in America, you'll hear something more articulate, something more reasonable. You may agree or disagree, but the level of stupidity and superficiality that comes out is incredible. Now, as for Israel itself, I think, by the way, the support for the war is far more than 80%. Far more. I didn't see that poll, but I saw another poll which I think is even higher. I think what this poll does not, maybe it sort of refers to the Palestinians in Israel as part of the poll, and of course most of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are 20% of the population, reject the war. But among the Jewish population. Now, this is something I said before. I think there is a conclusion, and you're absolutely right about this. If anyone would put the change from within the Jewish society as a precondition for the liberation of Palestine, for the decolonization of Palestine, for the end of Israeli oppression and occupation. Anyone who would say this is a precondition is someone who would accept that this will never happen. There's no other way of putting it. Namely, the chances of a significant transformation of the Jewish-Israeli perspective on the reality to such an extent that it would enable conducive circumstances in which to build something new is not there. This is not the only cases in history. We had such cases in history before, and when the international community, or at least enough people in the international community with power to do something, are convinced that a change has to come, regardless of this consensual rejection of the change, as happened with the white community in apartheid South Africa, you don't wait for the change. In fact, you believe that strong pressure, condemning that state as a pariah state, imposing sanction on that state, may eventually create a far more fundamental change from within. But if you talk about dialogue, persuasion, or Israeli realization from the 7th, as some people were telling me, but the Israelis would understand in the long run, because of what happened on the 7th of October, that power is not everything and that they are living in a precarious reality. I don't buy into it. I don't buy into it. They always, it gives them certain adrenaline to live in such a precarious situation. The authorities know how to manipulate it in such a way that it doesn't, on the contrary, it makes Israel more right-wing, more intransigent, and much less flexible in its ability to offer anything substantial in changing the situation. So I think, we're coming back to something I know that, at least with Usama, I talked about it a lot. This whole, what one of my PhD students, actually in Santa Cruz, Andrew Myers, calls, he calls it the orthodoxy of peace. He says we have to liberate, not we four, but we have to liberate other people from, and take them out of the orthodoxy of peace, namely that the situation will change through negotiations, through dialogue, through a diplomatic accord. No, it will only change when the whole perception would be the need to pressure from the outside in order urgently to change a situation of destruction and oppression.
On that side, Ilan, the question about, 100%. The argument that's often made that Jewish society inside Israel needs to be persuaded to go along with democratic reform and this kind of thing, or to embrace the anti-apartheid struggle. 100%. And I think talking to you and Osama, a pair of historians, you know better than I do that as far as I know, there's never been a case of historical transformation for the cause of justice that has happened because the oppressive side just felt bad, right? South Africa is the obvious case, but the European aristocracy did not want there to be democratic reform in Europe. They resisted it. They had to be dragged to it, and I think it's a similar kind of thing will unfold. So here's another question. It goes back to something you said before about, you could say global Palestine, global Israel, or just the image of Israel in the West, in the global West, and the way that that's changing. And again, this is something the three of us have talked about before. My brothers and I, that if you go back to, for example, the movements, the episodes, let's say, or the occasions that have kind of helped shift Western perceptions of Israel in the past, 40 something years, right? Because I think there was a kind of consensus through the 60s, most of the 70s. There's a sense of consensus in the West about what Israel was and so on. And that it began to change in 1982 with the invasion of Lebanon, the siege of Beirut, Sabra and Shatila, and then the first intifada changed it again in the late 80s, and then 2006, Lebanon absolutely shocked people. I remember getting emails and phone calls from people that I hadn't talked to in years in the summer of 2006 saying, "Are you okay? Is your family okay? We're seeing what's happening. It's unbelievable," and so forth. Gaza 2008-9, Gaza 2014, Gaza 2021, and now this. And it seems to me, and now tell me whether you think I'm being naive here, it seems to me that what's happening now, especially the duration of this, because it's gone way beyond 2006, which was 33 days. This is 60 something days already. It's gone beyond, if I remember right, even 1982. The number of killed has gone beyond the Nakba itself, certainly gone beyond 82, as far as if my memory serves. Like, in other words, there's a kind of, we've gotten to a point of excess here in the forms of violence, the visualization of violence, the scale of violence, not just in terms of sheer killing, but the total destruction. The destruction now, I forgot what the percentage is. 70% of houses in Gaza have been destroyed. As you said, people being moved around like chickens in a chicken coop, and the evisceration of public services, healthcare, all this kind of stuff. It's shocking people. I think more and more and more Westerners would not want to be affiliated with this state. So the question is, what would it take for that reality of Western shock, which I think is there and it's manifested in the demonstrations we see all around us? What would it take for that level of shock, in the absence of further strengthening boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, to penetrate into Israeli consciousness at large, so that they realize we're losing the Western world, basically? Or is that naive to think that such a thing is possible?
No, first of all, it's not naive, and we are also, as well as academics, we are also activists. So we have to believe that we can do that, or at least contribute to that action. In the beginning of next year, I'm going to publish a new book, which is called Lobbying for Zionism Across the Atlantic. And it's an historical assessment of the lobby for Zionism over 100 years, starting in America in 1918 with the creation of the American Jewish Congress in Philadelphia in the end of 1918, and starting with the early Bible Society in Britain in 1850, in order to explain that actually if you build a lobbying for such a long time, then you are able to create an inertia of political elites adhering the line of the lobby without the lobby working too hard, because the longevity of this kind of infrastructure is very, very important. You can see it in the American Congress. I don't have to tell you, you're more familiar with this than I am, but I definitely can see it also in the British Parliament. So until today, I think, as horrific as the visions or pictures from Palestine were, as wide as the support in the civil society for Palestine has become, I can see this, what I call the inertia lobbying structures on the places in the West where policy is made, namely parliaments and government mainly, with the help of some mainstream media and academia. I can see that as kind of the last attempt to block the tidal wave that comes from below, from the civil society, that eventually can change politicians' point of view, not even on a moral basis, even on an electoral basis. You can see it with the analysis now in America. What do the Arab vote in Michigan would do to the Biden campaign? This is not a moral discussion about the Biden policy. It's a very functional, electoral analysis of Biden's or the Democratic Party chances in the future. This is, it doesn't yet happen on such a scale that I can see this wave breaking through this wall of this lobbying wall. But I think you're right. The cracks in that wall are getting wider and wider. And it always reminds me of the kind of conversation I have with young Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, because unfortunately I cannot get to the Gaza Strip. But I remember a last visit to the Jenin refugee camp, and kind of analyzing for them as much as I could exactly that change in the civil society, and comparing how bad it was to talk about Palestine in America in 1980 and how easy it is in the campuses to talk about Palestine now. And of course they look at you and say, but the Jenin refugee camp is the same. It's worse than it was in 1980. You kind of feel dumb, kind of saying, what do you tell them when it has no impact? But I kept saying to them, I know, I fully understand, but these processes are dynamic. They're not static. and they are eroding. I gave them the kind of this metaphor of the water that erodes slowly the rock. It erodes that one, and therefore I agree, Sari. I do think that eventually it would get there. I wish it was quicker. I wish it was wider, because the clock of this, it's like, I always feel like we are working with two clocks when it comes to Palestine. There is the clock of the change of the international community, or if you want, global Palestine becoming stronger and more important, but it's a very slow pace. And then there's the clock of destruction on the ground, which is quicker and fiercer. In fact, I think because of the other clock, because of the change from without, and which is an indication that the Zionist project is beginning its end, to my mind. I think we're in the beginning of the end of the Zionist project. Because of that, the project itself is even more ruthless, more barbarian, more savage than it was before in its action against the Palestinians, which is, by the way, historically, you can find other examples for that kind of last existential fight of such political projects. And this is, on the one hand, a very worrying period for the Palestinians in particular, especially Palestinians on the ground, but it's also a hopeful moment of an historical opportunity, which we hope that the Palestinian national movement would know how to seize, because there will be a vacuum. The question is I do hope there is. I have a lot of faith in the younger Palestinian generation that is less fragmented in its vision, in its understanding of the world, and so on. So I do hope that there will be this kind of, movement that would seize the moment, because the moment will come. I don't know when, and I'm not going to predict, and it can take longer than we hope for, that's for sure. But these processes are happening, and this wall that protected the politicians from the opinions of the civil society is getting lower and lower. There's what I found out, that the lobby never invested much in civil society. It began to invest in civil society in America in particular, and then in Britain, when it felt that the civil society begins to influence the politician. Then it became very ruthless. They went to every community center in America, every church, every campus where they thought someone is criticizing Israel. They didn't do it in the beginning because they thought it doesn't matter what people say in the church or community or in university. But suddenly they realized that the world is changing, and this is anyway. Don't get me started talking with it. I just finished the book, so I can talk 5 hours on this. I won't do that. Sorry.
Ilan, thank you for that. So just to follow up on that question, one thing that strikes me when you said that you talked to German colleagues or people in Germany and you found them infantile. Of course, it's not just in Germany, by the way. Maybe in Germany it's especially so. But you have the same in the United States and many other parts of the world, where people's critical facilities and faculties just disappear when it comes to Israel and the way they argue for it. But is it stupidity or is it racism? And how does, as a historian, when you think through the dehumanization, the decontextualization of the Palestinians is such a fundamental part of this, what you called infantilization, or the infantile way of arguing, or the lack of solidity or lack of depth. Is it racism? Isn't it much more a question of racism and dehumanization, decontextualization, rather than just being stupid? And because they can get away with it, because they've been doing this for decades. The same thing with blacks, the same thing with black liberation movements, the same thing with indigenous liberation movements, the same thing with Algerians. Isn't it always the case that you have these kinds of infantile discussions that are based on dehumanization and decontextualization? That's one question. And then the other question, which I think we the three of us have been talking about a lot, is what about in this vision that you have of cracks in the wall, what is the place of resistance? Because that's a very difficult question. In other words, military resistance on the one hand versus the civil society resistance in the West. And these are two different tracks. And they're not in coordination as far as I can tell. And so that's a much more complicated maybe question.
Yeah, absolutely. As for your first question, I think it's a bit more complicated, especially in the case of the Germans. I'll tell you why I'm not entirely sure about the racism there. Maybe I'm isolating a case study. Maybe it's true about America and so on. Maybe. The people I talked with are people who welcomed the refugees from Syria and Lebanon, 1 million refugees from Syria and Lebanon, when the rest of Europe closed its gates. When Britain didn't take one refugee from Syria and Lebanon, Germany opened its borders. And these people are busy day and night in social work on behalf of the refugees, and are fighting the German right wing in its racist attitudes. That was what drove me mad. I mean, that they now are in such a difficult situation, because they say the refugees we helped to come to Germany are pro-Hamas, are pro-Palestinian. We don't know what to do with this. Why did we invest so much? So I think it's maybe in some cases racism plays a role here. But I would see it differently, I think, because of the German history, and because of the lobbying, and because of Christianity and its attitude to Judaism. Jewish racism somehow, rather the Jewish racism is not considered to be racism. Which is what Israel is. It's a racist Jewish state. So I'm not entirely sure about the German case. I can see it in other cases. For example, in Italy and France, I can see what you say very, very clearly. But I think it's worth for us to have this more higher resolution when we analyze these positions, because there is timidity there. There is timidity. There is a totally normal human kind of reluctance to be involved in something that may lead people to call you an anti-Semite. So what do you need this? You may even agree that what Israel is doing is terrible, but why do you want to get into this public debate being condemned as an anti-Semite? So I think it's a far more complex issue, and I work with some German PhDs who work with me in Exeter, and we are working on this, and we can see that in fact where there is racism, it's interesting, is that nobody there is making also the connection to German colonialism in places like Namibia, and the way that Israel is kind of being approved by these people. So there is this level of racism because Germany never dealt with a colonial question, although it has a colonial past, But as I say, I think we need a more kind of intricate analysis of this than just either what I said or what you said. I think it's a bit more.
Well, this is Osama. Following up, I agree with you. Of course, we need more nuance for sure. That goes without saying. But it's more this. I was reacting to your point about the way their level of argumentation when it comes to Israel drops across the West.
Yeah. I understand what you mean, but what they do, that's my point. I call it infantile because it's not their own point of view. They just parrot the Israeli point of view because that's the most secure way of not losing your job in the German academia.
So you think this
is the most secure way?
You think it's timidity rather than a conviction?
It is timidity
they resolve.
I read their articles,
but they resolve the question of German guilt for the Holocaust and the persecution of Jews at the expense of the Palestinians, and this,
I do think so.
Yes, but so that's not timidity. There's something else going on when you're claiming to be moral and claiming to atone for the Holocaust at the expense of another people, continually at the expense of another people. That's not timidity. That's something else. That's why I said. I mean, that's why I don't know what.
I see what you mean.
I wouldn't call it timidity. I would call it something else. I would call it hypocrisy. I would call it cognitive dissonance. You can call it whatever you want, but I would certainly not just say. I mean, timidity for sure. But then, Ilan, what about the point about resistance? And Karim and Sadi may want to jump in on this question of resistance go ahead, Sadi.
Yeah, so I definitely want to get that, but just as a writer on this, the question you were just talking about now, let's come back to resistance in one sec. But just because the question of this kind of, when you see what would otherwise be high-powered intellectuals becoming infantile, Ilan, I think it's a very important point. I mean, I don't know about the German case, but certainly here in the U.S., we can see very, very prominent academics, scholars, very prominent deans of law schools, for example, who come to mind. in the case of Britain, you have people like Simon Schama who are otherwise functioning. They function in terms of their own fields. When they talk about this, they become like even to say children is a bit too, it's giving them too much credit in a way. It's like they lose all things we're trained to do as scholars, to think, to read, to analyze. They seem to lose all of that at the push of a button. So that's just one reflection of that. Then we'll come back to the question of resistance, because I think that is a really important point.
Thank you. Yeah, I do agree. But maybe we'll find another word for it between timidity and racism and infantility. Anyway, Karim, do you want to jump in on resistance, or we want me first to reply to Sama?
No, maybe reply to Osama, and then I'm gonna, because I have a couple of questions on the question of resistance. Yeah.
Sama, you're right. It's absolutely a difficult question, and if I look at this wider solidarity movement with the Palestinians in the West, you can see a bit of discomfort when it comes to relating to the armed struggle or the resistance on the ground. I tried to give an example in one of my talks in London, I remember, to explain why it is important to draw the lines more clearly of what does it mean to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people, taking into account that I was talking to people who have to be careful not to be seen as supporting, if you want, terror according to the British law and so on. We don't want to turn them into people who would lose everything just because they use the wrong language, while their hearts and souls are in the right place. We don't need them to do that. But I gave them an example of the 6 Palestinian political prisoners who escaped from the Megiddo prison, if you remember, a few years ago, and were caught later. Some killed, some caught. And I said, I knew it, and I said, I knew who exactly was with me morally and politically and ideologically, if like me they felt a sense of relief, even happiness, when hearing about the escape, and total sense of sorrow and disappointment and despair after they were caught. And I said I could count on my 2 hands the number of people who felt that way. And it was very interesting to see how people found it a bit difficult to articulate a clear position. And I was not yet talking about a military operation. I was talking about political prisoners escaping from jail. I think this is changing. You're right. There's still a gap. Between the willingness even to call for free Palestine from the river to the sea, talking as academics about decolonization, a one-state solution if you want, and taking a more guarded attitude towards the armed struggle. I think what I can see is narrowing the gap, actually maybe also because a little bit about the 7th of October, is the opening of the discussion of the right of self-defense. Because Israel was using as a pretext the right of self-defense to do what it wants. And it was very clear that for years, the Palestinian right of self-defense was not an issue of conversation. So it comes. And that is a more comfortable zone, I think, for people to talk about, because they can say also the Palestinian right of self-determination has to abide by international law, cannot deteriorate into war crimes, cannot include atrocities, but it does not invalidate the right of self-defense, and not just in peaceful means. But I do think that we will find that people are much more aware of the possible implications of what individually can happen to them if they are not careful in the way that they articulate themselves. But I think, all in all, I can put it even more dramatically if you want. I think if the Hamas would have stopped after occupying, I think it was 8 military bases, maybe even more, capturing tanks, capturing soldiers, stopped there, did not go into the kibbutzim, into the settlements, I do think that this would twist it, not in a fundamental way, but it would have changed a little bit the conversation, not among people who are, intuitively pro-Palestinians, but among these groups that we are still trying to win over, which are not totally decided on this issue.
I mean, to go to the question, Sama, that you had raised earlier on the question of there's the kind of global solidarity movement on the one hand, and the BDS and this kind of thing. On the other hand, as you were talking about now, the question of armed resistance, violence in general. In Lebanon, of course, the Israelis had occupied Lebanon for some decades and still occupy parts, some areas in South Lebanon. People forget that. They think occupation ended in 2000. In fact, it really didn't. Not to mention the overflights every day. All these things are, of course, very documented. The model here, of course, Lebanon itself is split, maybe a bit like the Israeli society. It's kind of split in two. But there's certainly a model that says that if the resistance here did not use, it's pretty clear, I don't think it's even very controversial, that if the resistance did not use violence and didn't have a very clear armed resistance component to it and organized its society, especially in South Lebanon as such, it's pretty clear that the Israelis would have, if not stayed in occupation of southern Lebanon, they would have had some kind of demilitarized, which is still their fantasy now, to demilitarize all South Lebanon. We hear it today, right? There's mediators, and the French and the Americans are coming back and forth saying, we want Hezbollah to go, South Lebanon to demilitarize. UN Resolution 1701 is kind of about that. So putting in a weak government and a weak army, Lebanese army, and you remove any actual proper armed body that could resist the Israelis, or even put a limit to what the Israelis can do. And that's effectively what's happened, this kind of balance of terror, balance of power kind of thing. So the model of resistance coming from Lebanon is extremely strong. And sort of what Hamas did in this year, on October 7th onwards, in its core, in the military aspect, again, leaving aside what it did in the settlements, etc., but in the military side of it, sort of comes from within this larger axis of resistance that does come. We have to talk about it. It does come from this Iran to Syria to Lebanon, Iraq. We see it in Yemen. There is this larger regional geopolitical tension or battle that is going on between, on the one hand, some in the Gulf with the Israelis, and that's precisely what the Biden administration, just like the Trump administration, there was a continuity in this, wanted to focus on that on the regional level. And on the other hand, this kind of axis of resistance that's centered around Palestine, but really had its strength coming from various military components within these countries. And Lebanon was a very important part of this. So as a model, this idea that if you do not use violence, if you don't have armed resistance, you're going to end up with the Palestinian Authority, you're going to end up with occupation and settlements, and you're going to be pushed, and you're going to end up in your ethnic cleansing. And here we are. So it seems that, of course, Palestine is very different, Gaza is very different than Lebanon for all sorts of reasons. But I'm wondering, just even as a model, how does this work? How do you see it in this sense, even historically and now?
Well, Karim, unfortunately, there is also another model, and that's the model of 2006. The model of 2006 says that if Israel is reacting not to a successful Hezbollah attempt to push it out of Lebanon, but is reacting by attacking Israel proper, Israel has the military might to destroy half of Lebanon. And if the Hamas does a successful operation, it leads to the destruction of Gaza, not just partial destruction, but the whole destruction. This is also something that has to be, the model is a bit more complex than the one you are facing. I read it a bit differently. And I think, as I'm not officially an historian of the Palestinian resistance movement, but if I read correctly, the Palestinian resistance movement, that is a movement that was unable to liberate physically any part of its homeland, and its greatest success was to keep the Palestinian issue alive. And this is very different from the Hezbollah, I think. And keeping it alive is a great responsibility. it's keeping also the people alive, not just the issue alive. I'm not just talking about the issue alive. Let's wait with the historical judgment of the 7th of October as an action that contributed to the liberation of Palestine. I would wait for this. What is happening in Gaza now, of course I know who is to blame. Don't misunderstand me. But I'm saying, I'm always depressed. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I remember an interview with Hassan Nasrallah on Al Jazeera, where he said very clearly, if I had known that the 2006 war would end the way it ended, I would not have ordered the operation to capture the 3 Israeli soldiers. He said it. I remember it. I have it on record. So things are complicated. I'll tell you how I see it. If I said that the condition of change of the Israeli Jewish society from within as a precondition for the liberation of Palestine is a fantasy, I'm afraid to say that anybody who believes that the Palestinians have the military power themselves to defeat Israel is also an illusion, to my mind. I fully understand why people are fighting. You talk to young people who are part of these groups, very brave groups, like the people in the Jenin refugee camp, in Nablus, and so on. I don't know if you listen to them. They don't talk about the liberation of Palestine. They said, I'd rather die in confrontation with the Israeli soldier than die as a dog in the Kasbah. This is not, they don't think that their military confrontation with the primitive weapons that they have against the Israeli army is something that would end even the occupation. I don't think they even think that they can end the occupation. But they say, they won't sit idle when their relatives are being killed, wounded, arrested, humiliated on a daily basis. There's a limit to what human beings can take. But I think this is not a strategic analysis, if I do it like this. This is an understanding of the reaction of young Palestinians to the situation. But because the Palestinians don't have an established national movement, because they don't have right now, I hope they will have, an institution that strategizes with a vision, with a strategy. Even a successful military operation like the 7th of October, if it doesn't come out of a clear strategy, and you can understand, is it a reaction to years of siege and bombardment? I fully understand it. But as an historian, if you want a more cool-headed historian, I don't think that this is an operation that would be remembered in the history as the contributing to the decolonization of Palestine as such. In fact, it contributed to another horrific chapter in the destruction of Palestine. And although I don't think that people would blame the people who did it, because it was very clear. So what I think we should separate, if we can, I know it's not easy because we are all emotionally, you're probably more than me, but we're all emotionally involved in this. We'll separate from analyzing tactical issues, one-off occasions, and an overall analysis of what is the decolonization of Palestine all about, what pushes it forward, who is going to push it forward, how is it going to be pushed forward, and what is the role of, kind of distribution of labor between the liberation movement itself, the regional powers, and the international actors.
Ilan, this is Osama. Thank you for that. We're approaching the end of our show, but I have a question to follow up on that, if I may, in terms of what Karim asked you, in terms of, because now you're saying, on the one hand, you're saying it's too early to judge the results of October, and you're correct to point that it's not just the axis of resistance, there's also the axis of Israeli power and the brutality of the Israelis and what they're doing and what they can do to Lebanon, what they did in Lebanon, what they're doing to Lebanon, what they've done, of course, and what they're doing to Gaza, to the West Bank, and so on and so forth. You have this extraordinary amount of power that they have. On the other hand, and you seem to be suggesting that it's actually a setback. My question is, earlier in the show, maybe I misunderstood you. You said that you felt that we're at the beginnings of the end of colonial Zionism. How do you reconcile these two? I mean, I'm trying to understand how, and in terms of thinking about the future, because you also said something here. I remember when you were giving a talk here at Berkeley, you said something to the effect that shocked some people in the audience, that the future ultimately is there is going to be millions of people living together, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, in Palestine. And there's a future together at some point. Now, you're a historian, I'm a historian, we're all scholars, but how do we get, I'm just trying to figure out how we go from where we are to that sort of vision that you have, but also how do you reconcile the pessimism of your response to Karim, or the caution, the note of caution, I should say, telling us let's not over analyze or over determine Hamas, Hezbollah, and all these things, because Israel has an enormous amount of military destructive power. You can't discount that. How do you reconcile that with your sense that it's the beginning, you said it's the beginnings of the ends of Zionism, or colonial Zionism at least?
Yeah. I think I hinted to how I reconcile it when I said that the end of a project like Zionism is one of the worst periods for the colonized people. That I'm sure that Zionism is going to end. I really believe it. I can see the indicators. I really see them clearly. I can see the indicators of the beginning of the end. But as an historian, I know that the beginning of the end can be a decade, 2 decades, even 3 decades. I'm afraid that as an historian, I'm allowed to say it, but as a human being, I don't want to say it. I don't want to be there for 30 years in a situation. And these 30 years or 20, hopefully a shorter period, are very, very dangerous. And the question is, how do we protect the people through processes that they are not always at their power to influence, that they are dangerous to them as well in the short run, but hopeful in the long run? I think that's the balance act I'm looking for. And I feel frustrated because I want to be led by a Palestinian liberation movement on this. I don't want to be part of the people who lead it. I'm not going to seek such a position. I think the whole failure of the liberation of the so-called peace orthodoxy was it never allowed the Palestinian to lead the way on how to solve the issues of historical Palestine. I want the Palestinians to lead it, but I want to comment on the responsibility that goes with it, not just for military successes, but also for the fate of the people themselves, and the fact that there is this ruthless, racist, supremacist state of Israel is a fact. And you have to take into account what the state will do when you do certain things. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do them, but you cannot ignore the price that people would pay in the name of that doesn't matter because it contributes to the longer liberation movement. I'm sorry, I don't come from this perspective. I care about people. I don't care only about big ideas. I care about people, and some of the people like you, I know personally some of the people who are affected by it. So, but for the last bit that he was saying, I as an historian, I know that decolonization is a messy process. It's a very messy process. It's not a pharmaceutical transition from the colonized, from the colonizer to the colonized. It's messy. It always has, unfortunately, violent stages. But it does have the potential. I'm not sure it will, but it has the potential of building or leading to something different. Something different that I don't know if Israeli, maybe I exaggerated in Berkeley when I said millions of Jews. I have no idea how, and I don't care, by the way, how many Israeli Jews today would like to live in a decolonized, liberated Palestine. I really don't care. I do still think that many of them will, but that's not a very important prediction of mine. More important is to say I don't really care. It's not a condition, not a precondition for me. But I do think that, yes, this decolonization, the implosion of Israel from within, what you talked about, the international community, the continued struggle, definitely the continued struggle, including the continued armed struggle of the Palestinians, all of it, it's not one factor. All of these are factors that accelerate the decolonization, the end of the Zionist project. The end would leave a vacuum. Vacuum is going to be filled with something. And I think it can be filled with, reconnecting Palestine to the Arab world, turning Palestine into a factor that helps the Arab world to deal with its issues, because there's such a brilliant human capital there that can help to do this. I mean, all this building on models that you have written about in the past and so on. I mean, this is not just a utopian kind of analysis. I really use history as a source of inspiration, because one of the things, and with this I would end, one of the things I suddenly realized when I talk to people in the West, in particular, in the global North, all their historical examples that they feel can inspire a decolonized Palestine or a better future, they all come from the West. They all come from European history. And I say, I'm sorry, we have other resources. We have other reservoirs of good ideas in the past that can inspire us for building a different state system, a different relationship between communities and interrelations between human beings. It's not all there in the wisdom of the Enlightenment and the anti-Enlightenment and all these periods of Western philosophy and historical experience. And I think it's important to engage also the young generation with reading about it and using it as a proud heritage that has something to teach us about both the methods and the ways for decolonization, but also beginning to envisage what will come afterwards.
Could I just ask one last thing, if you have a minute? This is Karim. Just as one side note, in Lebanon, people are often talking, or at least a lot of people are talking about this idea of the final war. There's this expectation, and in fact, when things began here, and there is a state of war going on, even if it's quote unquote limited in South Lebanon. People in Beirut don't even know, they don't particularly care often that there is actually shelling and people dying in southern Lebanon. But so if it's not this, some people think, okay, this was going to be the final war. And if it's not this, there's going to be a final war, because these two projects of this well-armed, well-trained kind of axis versus this kind of what from here it clearly sees as an intransigent kind of colonial, settler colonial, nuclear armed country that is even more fanatically supported by the United States and Europe than ever. That these are just two visions that in which the kind of global solidarity movement is, I don't want to say irrelevant to, but it doesn't have that much of an impact. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm just saying this is often, from when you're in a country like Lebanon, this is often the view by a lot of people, where whether they're for or against it doesn't really matter. But this is the idea that there's going to be this final war. Yeah. So if you have anything to this, but I also wanted to ask. No, please go ahead if you wanted to say.
Yeah, I just want to say it reminds me, of course, that there are unknown factors and huge coalitions that we are not all relevant to them. But historically, looking at cases where these kinds of things happened without supposedly influence of local forces, you realize that it's much more complex. I'll give you an example. We all know that the fall of the Berlin Wall was very important in contributing to the fall of the apartheid system in South Africa, because it led the United States to join the sanction regime on South Africa, which is very important. This was not the result of the work of the ANC. This was not the result of the work of the pro-ANC solidarity movement. This was a new a capitalist reconsideration of American interest in a world where the Soviet Union disappeared. It had nothing to do with liberation, decolonization, even the end of apartheid. And one of the negative results of this is that the neo-capitalist system in South Africa still operates, and a lot of the issues that are still there. So yes, there is this attempt, but I do think that the world, we don't always understand who are the young people who are now 15 and 16 would be in 20 years' time. We don't. We assume we do, because some of us have children and we say, oh, we know exactly we have no idea. We have to accept historically that even in close-knit societies, circumstances are as important as parents, as families, and so on. And maybe a different worldview is also developing without people in Lebanon seeing it, maybe because of the situation, where suddenly moral issues are coming back. A young woman that was admired for her fight for ecology is now admired for her fight for Palestine. These things were not there before. This intersectionality, this transnational solidarity. I have these conversations with Noam, who sometimes depresses me, Noam Chomsky, about this. I do think that I do believe that the fact that my generation didn't achieve something, I'm not going to say that this is my legacy for the next generation. Maybe they're coming from a different perspective that I haven't looked at. Maybe they have a different belief in themselves. Maybe they're more, maybe because of us, they're better educated and we allow them much more freedom of thought than our parents allowed us. Let's be honest about it without going. I'm talking here with three brothers. I'm not analyzing the family. Don't misunderstand me. I'm just talking. I'm talking about in general. I'm talking about general. I see it on my own. I have two boys, and I see how differently they react to certain crises in lives and dramas in life compared to my panic way of dealing with things. And I'm very impressed. I'm very, very impressed. And I don't have it, and they have it. So yes, I can see the desperation, the almost defeatist on the one hand. And I will give you as a final sentence the other side of it. I think there is a return, and I say it on the basis of a PhD students of ours, there's a return of anarchism, especially in the West Bank. Not anarchism in the simplified media term of anarchism, kind of people throwing stones at banks and putting bombs in institutions, of the free thinking that anarchism brings with it among young Palestinians. And I'll tell you what is the major benefit of a slightly anarchist point of view. It's the willingness to open up all the questions. Nothing is taken for granted. Nothing is carved in a stone, and there's a willingness to reconsider everything. At the same time, still involved in the struggle for liberation and the commitment. The two are what we thought would be mutually exclusive, in fact, is not mutually exclusive, because it enhances the assertion, the bravery, the assertiveness of these young people to say, we are also fighting for our position in the society, not just for liberation. And people told us, oh, put aside your struggle for your position in society because we are facing the occupier. They don't accept it anymore. They don't accept it anymore that you can use the occupation as a pretext not to allow a transformation of the Palestinian society from within. And this is, to my mind, very, very positive, and something that happens in other parts of the world. But be careful, I'm a relentless optimist, my family will tell you, and you should never listen to such naive optimists. But it served me well until today, so I hope I can infect some people with my optimism, which is better than COVID-19, let's face it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ilan. We also, of course, are optimists, just like you. You have to be at some level. I mean, otherwise, deep down, we're all optimists deep down. And we're going to wrap the show. And thank you, Ilan, so much for coming on here. I don't agree that you've contributed nothing. Your generation has contributed a lot. All our generations are contributing. This is a cumulative process. But like you, I think all of us share not just the optimism, but the faith in a new generation. But we thank you, Ilan, for coming on the show. Mahdisi Street, thank you for your wisdom. Honestly, thank you for your insights. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you for your bravery. And thank you, of course, to all the listeners and the viewers of Mahdisi Street podcast. Until next time. Guys, what did you make of that? That was an incredible interview with an incredible scholar, historian. I mean, Ilan, he's on the one hand, like all of us, he's optimistic, and at the same time, he's a realist. And there's a kind of like a profound amount of what brings us down to earth in a sense. I mean, our sort of. So, what did you make of it?
No, I was going to say that the interesting thing. I mean, it was an amazing interview, and he said so many things. But I was interested when he said, a couple of times that the Zionist project is coming to an end, and that this and that's
the beginning of an end. He said,
beginning is coming to
okay.
So the beginning of an end, and that in the end that this was going to create more violence than ever. As this colonial project begins to shut down. And of course, as a historian, it's not going to be 1 year or 2 years, but a larger unit of time, which makes sense. It's just difficult to reconcile that a little bit for me with this notion that the Messianic movement is growing in power there. On the other hand, you have a kind of growing, Hezbollah, Hamas, kind of armed resistance that also kind of seems to be growing as well. So it's I wonder and the connections with the global solidarity movements as well. So they're all kind of slightly different things going at different speeds, and so it's not clear to me what's going to happen, considering it's a nuclear state with an increasingly fanatical leadership there and that are in control. So from my view, things don't look very optimistic, but I hope I'm wrong. And maybe you guys as historians have longer durée to kind of consider these things.
Well, I think Ilan actually was in agreement with you, Karim. I think he was saying, that's exactly what he was saying, that in the short term, it's going to be horrific. But he sees, as he said, there are elements or there are factors, I don't remember the word he used, that indicate that there's a sea change taking place. Sadi, what did you make of it?
I mean, I actually wanted to connect the two sides of it, because if I also think that we're in the beginning of the end of Zionism. I think this is the terminal stage of the Zionist project, and I think one reason you can, but in particular, one reason we can see it from the vantage point we're occupying now, as opposed to people who are on the ground there, is you can see the extent to which they've lost the American public, for instance, right? And we have to remember, America has been the incubator and the oxygen generator and the supplier and so forth of Zionism. And without it, it couldn't do what it's doing. So this is one of and I think they recognize that too. If you think about how much the Israelis invest in lobbying and cajoling and berating and all this kind of stuff that they and their supporters do here, it's because they recognize how important the American front is to their very survival. They recognize that. But the point is, when you see if you see what's happening in American universities these days in particular, I'm writing about a piece about this right now, this ferocious attempt to try to suppress all forms of anybody saying anything, basically. It looks like it's sort of, it's the academic equivalent of the blind lashing out that we're seeing unfold in Gaza in military terms. Of course, that's much worse. You can't compare, the destruction of life with censorship, but nevertheless, they are on a continuum. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin in a certain kind of way. And the Israelis or the Zionists here in the U.S. seem to think that if they can fire university presidents at will, if they can shut down all forms of discussion and thought and critique and so forth, they can win. I think they have a whole other thing coming. That's not going to work. You can't stop people thinking. I think they're delusional if that's what they think they can do. If they think they can boycott, harass, intimidate, silence, punish, censor, so that America everybody in America, all the kind of the academic class sort of goes along like sheep. That's not going to happen. I just don't see it happening, and I especially don't see it happening given the levels of student activism and counter repression that we're seeing among students and faculty in American universities. This is not going to end well for the attempt to suppress thought in America. It's not going to work. And I think we could see it as kind of a manifestation of this it's the last throw of the dice. It's the last desperate gesture to impose blind total censorship, and it's not going to work.
I hope you're right, Sadi. I tend to have a slightly more, I would say the more pessimistic or pess-optimistic view, which is to say that I think we're in for a very difficult period. I think the censorship is not going to stop. I think just like the Palestinians are suffering, and as Ilan was saying, the beginnings of the ends of Zionism, if of the colonial project, if that is in fact where we are, is going to entail a huge amount of violence that, of course, is going to fall overwhelmingly on the Palestinians and on the victims.